my plan was really to talk about these three main areas. The public health concern, or the risk, as we've been talking about. I think we've covered that pretty well this morning, so maybe just making a few points in that, but move on to another issue, which is also somewhat consistent of today's theme, is what, given everything we've heard today and the issues and concerns and the complexities associated with this issue, what should we do, or what are some options for us to consider in terms of managing this issue, or essentially what kind of risk management strategies should we or could we consider to move forward on trying to address this concern. And then lastly, just basically, and my focus would be talking about one proposal, which is a guidance which has been referred to this morning, related to judicious use of these products in food-producing animals, guidance number 209, as being a proposal for how we could hopefully try to move forward on managing the risks associated with the use of these products. And then I'll talk a little bit about some ideas in terms of how we possibly could implement that strategy. So obviously we've talked a lot already about what the concern is in terms of the use of these products and their potential for impact on public health, and I won't spend a lot of time on that. As far as just looking at sort of examples of sort of trying to manage risk associated with this issue, just historically, a couple of things that have happened in the past. For example, the issue of veterinary oversight has come up, and we've talked about that. And from FDA's perspective, that's something that really since the late 1980s, for any new antimicrobial product that's come forward for approval and is now was approved since that time as a new chemical entity, a new product, those products have all been designated as either prescription drugs or veterinary feed-directed drugs if they are to be administered through feed. And so basically the products that, since that time, the products that are over the counter are the ones that were approved prior to that time. Obviously, we've talked a lot about NARMs, and that's something that was initiated back in 1996, and efforts have been made to continually to improve that monitoring system. And then was also discussed quite a bit today, the fact that in the late 90s and early 2000s, we went through a process of looking at how can we address this issue as part of the animal drug approval process, leading to the establishment and implementation of a guidance, another guidance, which has been also referred to today, Guidance 152, which was implemented in 2003. That's a process that's we've implemented. It's focused on looking at assessing risks associated with the use of an antibiotic in a food animal, and overall we think that process has worked fairly well as providing a pathway forward that we can both address the public health concern but still provide a pathway forward for getting new products approved for use in food-producing animals. And so the reason I bring that up was really to sort of highlight what is sort of really the thrust of the issue we're dealing with, is the fact that as far as from sort of FDA's perspective, we have those products, the new products coming through the pipeline, and I think we've addressed that issue through putting guidance in place, assessing that as a routine part of the assessment process for approving drugs. The gap, so to speak, is the concern about those products that have been on the market, were on the market long before that assessment process was put in place, and in some of these cases, products that were approved many, many years ago, 30, 40 years ago, where resistance may have been an issue, but not certainly an issue or a level of concern that it is today. So we feel, certainly that this is an issue or a gap that needs to be addressed. I mean, certainly we hear that others have that same type of concern, whether it's Congress through some of the legislation that we've heard referred to today, or just the general concerns we've heard from the public. So in terms of looking at sort of where we are today as a sort of proposed strategy moving forward, and I think sort of again along the consistent with today's theme is, I guess I sort of would view this as a risk management strategy, having considered all we know about what the complexities are of this issue, and recognizing, I think we recognize, and it's been talked a lot about today, that we believe, from FDA's perspective, and this was some of what was discussed and outlined in this guidance, was talking about at least some of the science that's out there now, and it's been out there and it's been debated and put forward in various reports over the past 30, 40 years, that from our view, we believe there is science to suggest or indicate that that some action is warranted to address this issue. Is the science perfect? And clearly, as a number of people have said today, it's not, and certainly we would like there to be more definitive science. But does that mean that we don't do anything? And I think our view is there is sufficient science to warrant us to look at strategies for moving forward to take appropriate measures to mitigate the risk. And so that's sort of what we've chosen then, is to move forward with trying to lay out a strategy for doing that. So it's sort of why are we doing this? And I think looking at what we've looking at this issue, looking at the information we have available to us, we sort of looked at it and say maybe it's time that we try to take a more proactive approach to dealing with this issue and lay out a strategy, a framework for managing the risk and essentially addressing that gap that I referred to, which is the uncertainty or the level of concern that exists about those products that have been on the market that are currently being used, and try to develop some broad objectives in terms of as a sort of directional goal. Where do we want to shoot for? Where do we want to go in terms of moving forward in trying to address the concerns that are there about using these products? And essentially did that through using a guidance as a vehicle for doing that, as a way of setting a stage for developing and encouraging a voluntary sort of collaborative type approach for moving forward with it. So it's sort of looking at the sort of the key objectives then is really that, again, as discussed today, and it's really not an area of big debate, is that yes, using these products is a driver of resistance, and that therefore there's a need, or it makes sense from a sort of risk management viewpoint that you should use these drugs as judiciously or prudently, whichever word you prefer, as possible, and that means trying to use them in as targeted a way as possible and reducing what is considered unnecessary and inappropriate, which I understand defining that is somewhat of a value judgment. So it's this, the objective then was to identify some key measures for trying to establish that we believe are sort of appropriate or judicious use conditions. And what it's not is not a strategy that sort of lays out this is our path forward is to ban the use of drugs, but rather to mitigate risk through assuring that they're being used as appropriately as possible. And therefore, to sort of both address the public health concern, but still maintain their availability for managing disease in animals. And that includes treating, controlling, or preventing disease that may present a problem. So just in terms of scope, the scope, again, I mentioned here that earlier, from a risk perspective, we're not necessarily talking about antimicrobials across the board. We're talking about those antimicrobial drugs that are relevant, most relevant to the risk that we've identified, which is using the drugs that are going to potentially have an impact on public health in terms of affecting, ability to treat disease effectively in animals. And the other sort of scope issue, which has sort of bubbled up to the top, or from a risk perspective, so not only those drugs that are medically important, meaning they have relevance for human therapy, but are there certain use conditions that are believed to pose a greater risk? And this sort of gets to that exposure question, which, part of looking at the assessments, exposure is a key element. It's a key element of the Guidance 152 assessment process, that is a big driver, and the more you can drive down exposure, the lower the risk. And so clearly the feed and water uses of products inherently has sort of that baggage to go along with it. It's that there's a greater propensity to increase exposure just because of the way you're delivering the drugs. And so as far as scope, then there are other drugs that, if they're not medically important, then potentially we move forward with maintaining the use of those products as they're currently being used. And a good example would be the ionophore class of drugs, which was mentioned earlier. Really has no corollary in human medicine. There's really no evidence that it's a significant driver of any resistance that may have human health impact. And there may be other drugs, and there were several other drugs that were mentioned in some of the other lists that may fall into that same category. And certainly we need to get more clarity on that point. So really coming out of this 2009 document, there were two key recommendations, and I think they really boil down to these two things. One is move in a direction of limiting the use of these medically important drugs to those uses that are determined, that really felt to be necessary for assuring the health of the animal. And again, that has some sort of value judgment to it, but in this case, what we're saying is that our view is that those types of uses are those that are directly connected to managing a specifically identified disease, and whether that's treating that disease, controlling that disease, or preventing that disease. And then secondly, that we need to include more veterinary involvement in the use of those products as another way of managing the risk and bringing to bear the expertise of the veterinarian. So just taking each one of those individually, the first one is limiting the use to those uses that are necessary for animal health, and what does that mean? And really, I think what we're looking at here is, again, uses that you can connect specifically to managing an identified disease, either treating it, controlling it, preventing it. That includes, however you're delivering that drug, including through feed and water, understanding that, practically speaking, you just have to have that mode of administration available to you in terms of dealing with animals in a herd or flock management type situation. And that you're targeting animals based on the fact that either those animals are clinically ill or they're at risk of disease. And the other concept here is that, generally speaking, these therapeutic, what we would view as therapeutic uses, generally speaking, are, and again, this gets to the exposure question, more limited duration of use or more targeted time period in which they're used, as opposed to sort of a strategy where they're just used as a continuous additive to the feed. So, in contrast, I guess, what we're then saying is the flip of that is that we don't really consider that drugs that the use for, say, production purposes, and here's another terminology issue, meaning those that are for growth promotion, feed efficiency, the performance-enhancing uses, that those are not necessary itself for assuring the health of the animal. They obviously have benefits, and we've heard discussion about the fact that, well, perhaps some of what's driving the fact that you're getting enhanced growth is that it's controlling some underlying disease, and that may indeed be an effect, and we'll talk about that more, and I think we don't want to lose sight of that. The other fact is, just generally speaking, these are administered on a herd or flock-wide basis, so it does have that sort of risk factor that goes along with it in terms of exposure, and generally speaking, are going to be administered for extended durations. So, in terms of how we implement these things, and looking at this first item, which really is this idea of, for these certain drugs, that we should move in the direction of moving away from uses that are not necessary for assuring animal health. What that really means is then phasing out these production uses, but it also means maintaining the continued availability of the drugs for their therapeutic uses, treatment, control, or prevention. So, and as I mentioned, I think we acknowledge the fact and the concern that in having these types of discussions, that that discontinuing the use of these products for growth promotion use could have this sort of collateral effect of leading to increased disease in those animals, and the fact that there may be, in certain circumstances, having that drug on board in those animals is controlling some underlying infectious disease. And so I think part of this strategy that we're trying to move forward with is making sure that point stays at the forefront, and as we move forward with changing how these products are being used, and that really means changing how these products are, the conditions under which they're approved, the labeling, to reflect that and to identify where those gaps are, and to try to fill those gaps in conjunction with phasing out, removing the growth promotion type uses. So again, this is something that we feel is important to try to mitigate that potential sort of collateral effect. And as we move forward with sort of developing this strategy, or looking at trying to figure out how to get that done and identifying what would those gaps be. And so we really need input on trying to understand what the potential effects would be if we were to phase out those growth promotion uses. The second key recommendation again, relates to veterinary oversight. And the reason for that, I think, from a risk, sort of again back to sort of managing risk, is that we do believe that veterinarians can play an important role in ensuring appropriate diagnosis and serving as consultants to producers in making the best decisions about when to use drugs, how to use them, which ones to use. And so, we think that has a valuable role to play in this overall concept of ensuring that drugs are used judiciously or prudently. So, just as context, and historically, most of the products we're talking about, well, essentially all the products we're talking about right now that have label indications for growth promotion type use are available over the counter. And most of these drugs were approved probably more than 30 years ago, with the exception of a couple products that are used in feed, which do not have growth promotion claims. But the two more recent feed products, telmicin and fluorophenocal, these are two examples of more recent drugs that are labeled with veterinary oversight under the VFD process. So just in part of the strategy moving forward with greater veterinary oversight is the fact that many of the products we are talking about are feed-delivered products. And so moving to veterinary oversight means coming under what is referred to as the Veterinary Feed Directive, which is essentially existing framework that provides for veterinary oversight of a drug that's delivered, an animal drug that's delivered through feed. And that's essentially a statutory requirement that those types of drugs be designated as a veterinary feed directive. And there's specific regulations that are in place, that have been in place for the last decade or so, that outline how that process works. It basically lays out what the requirements are, really on the veterinarian, on the feed industry for the sale and distribution of the drug that's designated to VFD. But the fact is, as I mentioned, there's really only two products, or have been only two products, marketed under that situation for the last decade. So there hasn't been a whole lot of sort of stress on the system, so to speak. And so one of the things we have heard is that, again, implementing this then would mean moving products that are now OTC, changing their marketing status from OTC to either prescription if they're say a water product, to a VFD if they're a feed product. And that means that the labeling would change. That means that they're only marketed under that status and only can be accessed either with a prescription of a veterinarian or a veterinary feed directive, which is essentially the comparable sort of order from a veterinarian. And the bottom line here really is just simply we want to bring the veterinarian into the loop in terms of decision making. We're not suggesting here that we're pushing to say that the veterinarian has to be directly involved in administering any drug. It's just we think the veterinarian needs to be looped in. So some of the issues that are raised and concerns here about doing that are, do we have enough veterinarians to do that? I mean, and that the existing process is just too burdensome in terms of the record keeping and other things that go along with the veterinary feed directive as a process. And then also moving to veterinary oversight, what impact is that going to have on producers in terms of access to drugs. I mean, they will have to go through a veterinarian at this point to get those drugs that maybe they've gotten directly from a supplier before. And so what impact is that going to have on access? What impact is that going to have in terms of costs? So obviously one of the things we are looking at is trying to figure out ways to make this a more workable process, and have been working to seek input on that issue. In particular, we issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which is a sort of first step in the rulemaking process to say we're looking at ways in which we can make that process more efficient as a way of sort of setting the stage to facilitate this transition of moving products under veterinary oversight, and have been working to get input on that, including from a special AVMA steering committee that was created to provide advice to FDA. Again, the idea for doing that is to just make the system a more workable system in terms of the requirements and reducing the burden. And so, again, it's, a number of key factors, streamlining the VFD process, making sure it's clear and understandable, and clarify what a valid client-patient relationship means, and do that in a way that makes it a workable situation, but yet still provides for the fact that we obviously believe it's important that there be a valid relationship between the veterinarian and the producer they're consulting with, but make sure that it's a workable process. So next steps in terms of where we see it going from here. I mean, obviously, one thing, we issued this 209 document as a draft. We intend or need to sort of finalize that in some way. One thing we did here is that, it sort of lacked the detail of the how-to part. We said this is where we'd like to go, but we really didn't say how do we expect to get there. And thirdly, we need to really further move forward on developing and addressing this veterinary feed directive issue to make it a more workable process. As far as more details on implementation, a number of things that really are top on the list. One is that idea of defining more clearly, when we say medically important, what exactly are we talking about? Which drugs are impacted by this and which aren't? I mean, obviously that's an important question in terms of understanding how this is going to play out, what impacts it's going to have. And define more clearly what that process looks like. How are we going to make that transition in terms of changing the products? What are the data requirements going to be in terms of trying to address that concern that if there are gaps, animal health need gaps, therapeutic gaps that may result, how can we get those filled in an effective and efficient way? And then also, in a broad sense, what's the timeline for all this? I mean, what is our horizon? And that has a number of implications. So again, we've talked about the feed directive. We're hopeful to move forward on that, as well as sort of concurrent track to get that process clarified. And just on this point of timeline, and the impact, again, recognizing that time frame and how we do this is critically important, and the emphasis that we're looking at is through doing this in a sort of phased-in approach where we transition these changes in over time. And for a number of reasons. One, minimize the disruption, but also that, and to provide for sort of an orderly transition from where we are today to where we want to be in the future. This is not something that's going to occur overnight. I mean, we envision this occurring over a number of years. And the other concept with this is the desire to set some time frame in the future, some goal in terms of when we want to accomplish these goals, as a way of bringing order to the process, and as well as being able to establish some sort of equity across products. And so, in summary, I guess this is really something that we're looking as the overall strategy is phasing out these production uses, phasing in greater veterinary oversight. To do this through a voluntary process in a sort of collaborative way, and to do this as over a number of years to provide for an adequate transition time. And that really this transition period, I think, is important not only to assure those animal health needs are met that we talked about in terms of assuring that those gaps are filled, Also to provide us some time to further explore, and the idea of research and the issue of research has come up. The need to make more effort a concerted effort to explore and research other ways of addressing this issue through alternatives to antimicrobial use, management practices, other things that we can do. So I think that's an important element of it. To address the veterinary practice issues, updating the BFD process, and to look at ways to minimizing the overall disruption to the industry.